Ahead of talks in Geneva, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio warned that Iran's unwillingness to discuss its ballistic missile program with Washington is a big problem. Speaking during a visit to the Caribbean island nation of St. Kitts and Nevis, Rubio sought to bolster the justification for a possible armed intervention against Iran. He claimed that Iran poses a very great threat to the US.
I want you to understand, and everyone should know, that Iran poses a very grave threat to the United States and has for a very long time. They are in possession, first and foremost, after their nuclear program was obliterated, they were told not to try to restart it, and here they are. You can see them always trying to rebuild elements of it. They're not enriching right now, but they're trying to get to the point where they ultimately can.
Oman said Thursday it had received views and proposals from Iran on the ongoing talks. While the latest round of talks are aimed at addressing its nuclear weapons program, Rubio said there are major concerns with Tehran's conventional missiles as well. According to the US Congressional Research Service, Iran possesses short and medium-range ballistic missiles capable of striking targets up to 3,000 kilometers away.
Iran possesses a very large number of ballistic missiles, particularly short-range ballistic missiles that threaten the United States and our bases in the region and our partners in the region. And all of our bases in the UAE, in Qatar, in Bahrain. And they also possess naval assets that threaten shipping and try to threaten the U.S. Navy.
The U.S. Secretary of State echoed the president, saying Trump's preference was to make progress on the diplomatic front. Tehran has said that it will not agree to separate U.S. demands to restrict its ballistic missile program or to curb its support for anti-Israel armed groups.
But if you can't even make progress on the nuclear program, it's going to be hard to make progress on the ballistic missiles as well. So I wouldn't characterize tomorrow as anything other than the next opportunity to talk.
In recent weeks, the U.S. has sent thousands of troops and what has been described as an armada to the region, including 2 aircraft carriers along with other warships. It's a strike group, as well as fighter jets and refueling aircraft. Trump first threatened to bomb Iran last month as security forces brutally repressed anti-government protests in Iran, killing thousands of people. But since then, his focus has turned to Iran's nuclear program, which has been at the center of a long-running dispute with the West. Well, the Secretary of State for the US has made it clear that Iran's unwillingness to discuss its missiles and conventional weapons is a big problem. What is the US fearing? What really happened in that 12-day war last year, which has perhaps caused this kind of reprehension from the US? Let me discuss this further with our guests joining me. I'm being joined by Anne Elizabeth Moutet, columnist, The London Telegraph, specializes in international affairs, and I'm also joined by Collins Chong-Yu-Keat, foreign affairs and security strategist, University of Malaya. Ms. Moutet, welcome to both my guests. Ms. Moutet, let me start with you. There have been repeated mentions of Iran's missile program and conventional weapons. What is US fearing? Is it fearing? Let me rephrase that. And what does US anticipate if hostilities erupt with Iran?
Well, first of all, the US is pretty well aware of how the missile program is working in Iran. It also has got memories of the JCPOA, the previous Iran deal that was fostered by Barack Obama, and the fact that essentially the Iranian government signed up to it and at the same time kept on increasing its nuclear capacity. And finally, it gets very good information in the region from Israel, who have good reason to fear Iranian missiles, because every now and then Iranian missiles fall on Israel. So, and they have very good intelligence capacities. So there is this concern about the missile program and the nuclear program, which are linked. But I mean, even the non-nuclear missiles are a problem. Ask the Ukrainians. It's Iranian Shahed missiles that destroy buildings and homes in Odessa and in Kiev and in other cities in Ukraine. So Iran is seen as an agent of chaos by America. The influence of Iran on Hezbollah, for instance, all through the Middle East, but also through Africa. To a large extent, I think the decision is almost taken, because I don't think you move an armada of more than 80 big warships to the region without having strong intentions about this. And if Iran thinks that Trump is not bright enough and they can finesse him, the Iranians are traditionally have been for 5,000 years very intelligent people, but that would be a mistake.
All right, Ms. Mute, stay with me. Colin Skeet, I want to come to you. Now, let me just substantiate what I had asked. The armada which is surrounding Iran at this point, does that give a sense that US is fearful at this point of the way Iran is armed if there is a military conflict?
Well, we have seen how President Trump is not really a big fan of a protracted conflict without clear returns. It reflects classic coercive diplomacy to threaten force, to obtain concessions, and to raise the cost, to impose red lines, and of course to raise pressure on Iran's missile and nuclear programs. We have seen also how the US is also being threatened by the rising capacity of Iran's own conventional missile program, and hence we have seen how the negotiations have also included the need for Iran to limit its own missile capacity. But as we have seen, missile programs have always been the insurance policy for Iran, for the regime. I don't see any substantial progress on that. But of course, neither side wants a full-scale war. Iran is well aware, is well cognizant of the capacity of the US forces, especially under President Trump's no holds barred approach. And we have seen also how Washington wants Iran to believe that the strikes are real, and they are all capable of incurring costs on the regime should talks fail. But of course, we have seen also the need for both sides to practice restraint, and President Trump has repeatedly stated that all diplomatic channels and all diplomatic fronts must be utilized before the use of force is considered. And of course, the regime is being well aware of that. And of course, there have been also parallel strategic priorities for the US in terms of also competing with China, in terms of providing for the European security, in terms of also the Ukraine conflict, and of course also protecting the Western Hemisphere. So opening up a new theater now in the Middle East is also another risky approach and model for the Trump administration. But strikes are rising. The risk of strikes are also rising. But what I've seen here is the capacity, the trust system, and of course also whether the volume and extent of the strikes by the US on the bases in Iran, and whether the extent also and the volume of any retaliation by Iran and will determine the extent, of course, also on the second strike capacity by the US. So that's the extent of what we have seen here, the limited maybe surgical strikes, but I don't see any risk for now of a full-scale attack unless a total collapse of talks will be appear in the days to come.
Okay, I understand your point. Neither side wants to really have that conflict. That's what Colin Skeet is sharing with us. Now, let me just, before we come back to what to expect from these negotiations. Now, there's a report which is now suggesting that Chinese private intelligence firm is drawing global attention. And this is after it published detailed reports on US military deployments near Iran, revealing movements of the USS Gerald R. Ford, movements around US bases in West Asia, also around Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. I wanted to ask you, Ms. Mute, I'll come to you first with this. Is it unusual for a private Chinese company, especially given the scenario that we're in right now, to publish such sensitive information? Does it reflect China's intentions, making this a global aspect?
I think you're quite right. I think China is gaining in international leverage. And it has for some time, and to some extent, it's also taking up the place of its sometime ally, Russia. Russia had such firms. Russia still has also those firms. Both are, things like Wagner and things like the Russian usual efforts to gather intelligence. And it's very interesting that China is sort of emboldened by the quagmire into which Russia finds itself. But from the point of view of the Americans, first of all, they have fingered China for decades now as a potential enemy of the United States. So it doesn't come as a surprise for people who've been studying this. I remember seeing the first serious studies about this in Washington in the early aughts. So that's 20 years ago. And right now, China also needs to show that it exists, mostly because if I understand correctly, and I've spoken to Chinese experts, President Xi is not as strong within the smaller circles of the Chinese Communist Party as he looked to be, and therefore there's a policy which is very well thought through, and which China is continuing, but making it known is something that's pretty new.
Understood. Collins, over to you. And you know, these images coming out from China, this is just, I would say now, we can say it's a number of weeks ahead of a possible meeting between Trump and Xi Jinping. How do you see this now that the Chinese government is allowing it to go out towards the world, these images of US bases?
Well, essentially what China is doing now is to give a very strong narrative and message that China is invested in in the whole equation, in this whole power equation, especially in the Middle East. And we have seen also how the it's also to raise the threshold and to increase the leverage and bargaining chips of China leading up to the talks. But of course, also to send a very compelling narrative that this is not only about the projection of the U.S. conventional power, of course the U.S. presence in this part of the world, but also to send also this clear directive that China is also invested equally and that is more than ready now to play a bigger part in this whole equation. But we have seen how Iran's strategy is now resistant without triggering war. And of course, hoping that any miscalculations on the side of the U.S. would then be made as a pretext for this greater, having this greater legitimacy for Iran to strike back stronger. But of course, for now, you want to avoid greater provocations and to avoid also escalations or any kind of nuclear breakout. But of course, the capacity to maintain the missile deterrent and to maintain the negotiating leverage are still being seen as the main focus. But of course, the estimates of any probability of war, now the full-scale war, will depend on how President Trump will respond to the need of whether Iran has crossed the ultimate timeline of threshold of, providing greater costs and difficulties for the U.S. to eventually limit its missile capacity, and of course also to limit its capacity to bolster its proxies and allies in the region. And that, of course, the U.S. is not rushing towards a full-scale war, but the timeline to stop that is increasingly being tightened now. But the deal is still now to ensure that Iran and the regime believe that war is still possible and that President Trump is not to be messed with, as with the case of Venezuela.
It is still possible. Let me quickly fit in one more question before we run out of time. Ms. Mute, will Iran be willing to negotiate on its missile program if that is what it takes to simmer down the war rhetoric at this point?
To be brief, I think Iran will not negotiate in good faith. Because, first of all, they consider that is their national security and they take this very seriously. They do not want to lose their influence far beyond their borders, and this is a guarantee of it. Their avowed policy is to sort of establish a hegemony in the region. So the idea that they are going to take this seriously, probably they will, because again, 80 warships is 80 warships. But in terms of negotiations, every single negotiation that has happened with Iran ended up with Iran still going on doing what it was doing before.
All right, thank you. And Collins, your take on the same. Do you feel there was something which cannot be ignored from the last time there was a conflict, which was largely Israel and Iran, but US got involved? Israel did not come out of it without taking a fair amount of hits and a certain number of casualties, whatever was declared. Do you feel the missile program is non-negotiable going into these talks for Iran and it will stay that way?
Well, I will argue that there are certain aspects of the missile program that can still be negotiated in terms of the volume, in terms of the timeline. As I've stated, it remains one of the ultimate insurance policy for Iran. Of course, the nuclear calculations have also changed completely under President Trump's approach. But this is entirely different from the scenario of the Venezuelan, conflict. And of course, we have seen how President Trump has been willing, has been fast to enact force on that kind of different kind of conflict theater. But Iran is a different ballgame. And we have seen how President Trump is also contemplating different approaches. And of course, the talks now in the coming days will be of great importance. But I don't see any urgent timeline for the Trump administration to initiate a new theater of conflict in this part of the world, and that Iran understands that. But also Iran is also under increased pressure to act, of course, from this show of force. And but as we have seen in the case of Soleimani in his first term, that President Trump has the boldness and audacity to act on anything that is being seen as as threatening the U.S. interests and of course the interests of his allies in this region. But as I'll always argue that this can still be salvaged, and it depends also on the extent of how the regime is perceiving the message being sent by President Trump. But again, as I stated, I foresee that this will turn out still in a very much managed way in the next couple of days without a full-scale conflict.
All right. It's always good to have some kind of a positive outlook here, and war is never the positive outlook. Let's hope that there is something achieved in that negotiation room. Thank you so much to Anne Elizabeth Mute and Collins Chong Yu Keat for joining us here on Point Counterpoint.
Thank you.
Thank you.